Hey, how's it going? Welcome to week 6 of writing about literature, text and textuality. Um, I'm going to go over a couple things related to Lois Tyson's chapter 12 on postcolonial criticism and connect that to your discussion forum work for this week. So I'm just going to go over that. I'm going to try and make this a quick video and just hit a couple highlights within the chapter from Tyson's text, like I've been doing, and not really try to overdo it this time. Um, so basically, for this week, your work is to finish the two parts of the discussion forum for this week. One part involving posting a question regarding Tyson's text. So just in terms of like absorbing it, thinking about its concepts and postcolonial criticism, I would encourage you to think about the connections that you're seeing thematically between postcolonial criticism, Marxism, psychoanalytic criticism, African American criticism, and feminism, so that you can kind of see how these all start to come together. Especially by this point at the end of, this is chapter 12 in Tyson's book. You've skipped ahead and looked at chapter, which African American criticism is chapter 11. So at that point, you probably saw how she was bringing together multiple types of theory to show how African American criticism both has its own history and ideologies and ways of perceiving the world, but is also been developed and built on the works of feminism, the works of psychoanalytic criticism, and Marxism as well, because these are all parallel with each other. All of these bodies of theory that you're learning about and working to apply are all developing at the same time with each other, and often by the same writers. These writers are thinking about similar questions, and sometimes their works are more leaning towards feminism or more towards psychoanalytics, or in that case, your reading of psychoanalytic criticism and Lacanian psychoanalysis and French feminist psychoanalysis, French feminist criticism. There's a whole bunch of overlap, right? So that in that case, these fields are basically the same. But with some feminist writers, they're not explicitly Lacanian psychoanalysts. Similarly, not all feminists are Marxists, but some are explicitly Marxist intellectuals and are trying to develop a type of Marxist feminism, for example. Similarly with postcolonial theory. So the chapter, Tyson's chapter covers a great deal. I'm not going to discuss all of it. That doesn't mean that I don't want you to read it and absorb it, and especially also look at her her analysis of The Great Gatsby as a model of how one writes a postcolonial theory-based critical text on another novel. So with that said, I'm going to go over a few of these concepts, speak to them briefly, and keeping in mind that what you're being asked to do for this week is to look at Zaytoun as a postcolonial text. So your assignment says, for the second part of your discussion forum, consider how you suggest to your peers how you might use postcolonial theory to read Zaytoun. So that's the objective. So within that, some questions. Consider Zaytoun and Kathy as post-colonial subjects. So thinking about them as people shaped by the circumstances of colonialism and post-colonial, or what that might mean to have an identity shaped by and in response to colonial practices and discourses. So Kathy occupying an interesting liminal space as a white Louisianian, a woman, and a Muslim convert. So she sort of, Zaytoun himself is Syrian. He's actually born in Syria and then moves to the United States. Syria itself being a post-colonial society, right? A country that was at one point for a period dominated by other countries. First I mean, in the modern period, first by the Ottoman Empire, and then when the Ottoman Empire collapsed after World War One, it was handed over to France. So Lebanon and Syria were part of what's called the Mandate, um, given to colonial power, France, just as Jordan and Palestine and modern day Iraq were mandated to Britain to rule over. And these, France and Britain basically decided to divide up the Middle East amongst themselves after the end of World War One. If you ever seen Lawrence of Arabia, that movie, it's kind of about the buildup and actually the betrayal of the Arab tribes by the British and French governments. And there's a little bit about this too. No, it's a different agreement um, in the Netflix series The Crown. Um, but the point here being that Syria is a post-colonial society. It's one where it's independent. It has its own borders. Its dominant language is Arabic, and the particular Syrian variety of Arabic. But the mark of colonialism had its effect on Syrian society. Um, and so we get a little bit, I'm kind of going ahead of myself here, but we get a little bit of that in the middle of the text um, during Zaytun's memories about his brother, his late brother, Muhammad, who was the swimmer and sort of the pride of Syria. This famous long distance swimmer who was competing in these swimming events in the Mediterranean against Italians and Greeks and other people there in Syria, not known for having strong swimmers, and only having a very small coastline. Produced this great winner, and this is all occurring as Eggers is using the memory to retell us. It's occurring during this particular moment in the 50s when Syria and Egypt merged politically, and they created what was called the United Arab Republic, which if I'm correct, is actually still the official name of Egypt. If you look that up. So Syria, for a brief period, Syria and Egypt were one country. And most Americans don't remember this or know this. And briefly, I think Yemen was going to or did join the UAR, and then it fell apart. But partly and that had a lot to do with the dominance of Egypt in that alliance. So this was occurring during a time period when in the late 50s, this is all post World War II, the British and French colonial empires, because they still controlled a great deal up to World War II, they still controlled Syria, and Britain still dominated Egypt. It wasn't a full colony. But what happened was Gamal Nasser, who took power in Egypt, really sort of sparked this nationalist wave and this idea of Arab unity. So all of these countries with Arab populations or Arabic speaking populations had been dominated by the Ottomans and then dominated by the British and the French for such a long time. There's this sense that now they could unite and build and hopefully build one united Arab state, and that was Nasser's idea, and that's why Syria joined in this united Arab Republic. That was the dream. It's called Pan-Arabism. So there still is kind of a remnant of that in the Organization of Arab States, and it's kind of like a European Union, but less politically uniting. Anyway, so think about Zaytun as a person. His history and his brother's history, especially, is the kind of window into the after effects of colonialism, right? And you see in that the sort of story about of an independent country's pride in this figure, right? They built a statue of him after he died. He won all these awards, and the vice president of Syria was there, um, to congratulate them. So he becomes this figure of pan-Arab pride, which only makes sense in the context of what we're going to talk about in post-colonial criticism, which is the colonial discourses and especially Orientalism that over decades and centuries actually had the effect to make people in their cultures who were under colonial domination believe that they were inferior psychologically, socially, culturally to the societies that had dominated them. Okay, so going back to the post, so you're using question 4 on Tyson's page 426. So if you flip ahead to the part of her chapter, like her other ones, where she lists some questions that critics in that particular field ask. And in question 4, I kind of want you to focus on, I dropped my pencil. And question 4 says, what does the text reveal? So this case we're treating the text as Zaytun, reveal about the operations of cultural difference. The ways in which race, religion, class, gender, sexual orientation, cultural beliefs, and customs combine to form individual identity. In shaping our perceptions of ourselves, others, and the world in which we live, othering might be one area of analysis here. So I chose that particular question because I think it focuses on a very specific issue, and of course one that's very important to the novel as you're reading, right? Where Zaytun, his Arabness and the associations of his ethnicity and his religion are so tightly bound with what are today kind of neo-colonial perceptions about Arab people, about Muslims, about Muslim men, and how that played out, particularly at that time in 2005. So we're seeing, right, this is we're 2 years into the invasion of Iraq. We're about 4 years into the invasion of Afghanistan. So there's been multiple terror attacks, but also the war, the extension of the war, and the extension of the practices at Guantanamo Bay to the United States. So we're seeing in Zaytun a retelling of the War on Terror, and the War on Terror's connections to long-standing colonial discourses in a way that a lot of Americans, I think, are not quite aware of, because the United States did not participate in the colonial, in the same type of colonial domination in the Middle East that the British did and the French. The United States has its own colonial history dealing with Latin America, the Philippines, the Caribbean, but it didn't have land holdings the way it essentially did between 2003 and I don't know 2012, 2010, when the United States actually took over the government of Iraq and installed a colonial administrator. So. And of course, there are ramifications even further today, as I'm giving this discussion now in 2018, regarding the Trump administration's usage of Islamophobia directed especially towards sitting Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. So there's a lot of that in the way in which race and Islamophobia continue, and how it has its origins in colonialism and colonial discourse. Okay, so I just go over these notes with you. So as we're going, I'll kind of say some more things. So the key words in this block that I've given you from the discussion board are post-colonial subjects, othering, cultural difference, and its role in shaping our perceptions of ourselves, others, and the world in which we live. So I want to kind of like hit on that a little bit. So for Tyson, Postcolonial criticism is a subject matter and a theoretical framework, which means that it analyzes literature. It's a subject matter. It analyzes a certain set of literature produced by cultures that developed in response to colonial domination. So the literatures of Africa, sometimes people include South America. It's a little bit different because of when South America, most South American countries overcame colonization, but they can get grouped into this post-colonial literature. Um, the literatures of South Asia, India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Burma, the literatures of the Middle East, um, sometimes even literatures of the Balkans, the literature even of Ireland, because of Ireland's colonized history and its anti-colonial um, politics. The literature of Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, even China, and Korea as well, because Korea's was colonized by Japan. So you can take it in a sense and say, okay, well, what countries were under colonial domination, especially by European powers, sometimes also by Japanese or Ottoman empires, and then so this is really looking at a sort of 20th century phenomenon, and that's really the key in the subject matter, is that post-colonialism as a theoretical body has its origins, as I was saying, in other works of analysis and literature being done by colonial subjects in India, South America, the Arab Middle East, Africa, but takes, I think, the current form that people are analyzing when they talk about things like world literature um, or post-colonial literature, takes place in the emergence after World War II with the development of modern anti-colonial movements that won independence from colonial states. So Algeria, Ghana, Egypt, all of these things, India especially, right? Okay, so that's it. Postcolonial theory or criticism focuses on a particular subject area, right? A particular set of texts. But it's also a theoretical framework. It's also, just like we've been studying with psychoanalysis, feminism, Marxism, African American criticism, and other ones. If you get Tyson's book, she has a couple more chapters. It's a framework for viewing and asking questions about texts. So in this particular one, it seeks to understand the operations politically, socially, culturally, psychologically of colonialist and anti-colonialist legacies. So it looks at the ideological forces that came to dominate colonial societies and the colonizers' societies, and how these ideologies are found in the literature, even in literature that itself is not written by post-colonial peoples or subjects, or maybe even doesn't have anything directly to do with a colonial situation. So as you'll see, Tyson's writing about The Great Gatsby, which we don't typically think of as a post-colonial text, but it can be read using a post-colonial theoretical framework. That's what I mean by that. So it analyzes the ideological forces that maintained colonialism as a set of ideas. So that's one of the main things, is that to think about colonialism not just merely as the military domination of another society, another territory, but also the ideas that have to be carried out in order to sustain it. So just like classism, sexism, racism, anti-blackness, homophobia, these are all oppressive ideologies and ways of thinking and seeing the world that maintain oppressive dynamics. So there couldn't be Jim Crow as a form of domination in Southern society without a very particular developed ideology of racism, whiteness and anti-blackness that developed prior to the institution of Jim Crow and developed through Jim Crow, as well as causing anti-racist and anti-white supremacist ideologies to develop in response. So it's important to think about these things in dynamic relationship to each other. And it's important to think about how situations of colonialism are maintained through ideas, maintained through ideologies and ways of seeing the world. Okay, so then Tyson goes into sort of what post-colonial criticism looks at, and she says it's very interested in this idea that colonial ideology and the colonized peoples, there's a type of merger and antagonism between these cultures and discourses. So as we'll discuss a little bit more, they're very interested in this interplay that's social and psychological, and the difficulty of actually pulling out and separating these elements from, say, the culture of Britain and the culture of India, right? That Britain's occupation and over a century-long domination of India not only wasn't just a one-way street of domination, but also this interplay, this movement of peoples back and forth, the integration of economies, the adoption of cultural customs and ways of culture and language between these two, so that you get colonial subjects who are educated in British law, customs, religion even, and you get British subjects who live in India, grow up in India, identify with Indian customs and cultures, and yet are also part of these power dynamics, right? That the colonial subjects are always seen as colonial subjects and never fully British, or as in the white British, what's the term for them? Settler in India is never fully seen as Indian. So there's these power dynamics that are antagonized positions to each other. At the same time, you get a lot of anti-colonial solidarity between people in the metropolitan countries in Britain, France, etc. But you also get in that sense supporting the anti-colonial struggles. So she goes in and talks about colonialist discourse and cultural colonization. Post-colonial identity is itself constituted by this ideology and the reactions to it. So becoming a post-colonial subject is part of being subject to colonialist discourses and also the reactions to those discourses. So it's never just one way. So she uses this word discourse, which she uses a lot in the text. And just to kind of repeat some things, but look at her use of it, discourse means looking at the level of language and communication. But it doesn't just mean the use of a particular language like English or French that was used by the colonial administrations and institutions, which have left their mark on post-colonial countries. But discourse is the word for the social, psychological, cultural, and political assumptions, the arguments, the debates, and the ideas that are all transmitted, debated, formed, and reformed through institutional and political bodies set up. So everything from a colonial administration, the army, but also the church, health or welfare administrations, all of these things that would, education, especially the prison system, trade, banks, anything that would get set up and utilize the discourses of the colonizer would be transmitting these discourses. And so the discourses are the ways of talking about a thing. the ways of talking about the colonized, about their land, about their culture, about their customs. Um, and so what post-colonial theorists were looking at is essentially that the ways in which that colonized people were talked about was pretty uniformly negative, and not only negative, but intentioned to create a type of division. Okay, so this is something that we didn't read about, but in deconstructive criticism, there's an attention to the binary terms, the ways in which concepts and ideas are separated in binary areas, much like male, female, gay, straight, white, black. They're always seen in opposition to each other. That's the creation of a particular type of discourse. So in this case, discourse in the post-colonial sense is how the beliefs are expressed and shaped by the colonizers about the indigenous or colonized local populations and about the colonizers themselves. So how they talk about themselves in relationship to their other. So often or always in binary terms. So the colonizers talk about themselves as civilized, sophisticated, cultured, and they talk about the colonized peoples as savage, backward, or undeveloped. So these are all terms that Tyson is using. So colonizers seeing themselves through the language they use, the concepts used to define themselves socially and psychologically, as embodiments of the proper self. Okay, so here we come back to some psychoanalytic concepts, right? That the image of the self is constructed through the language that sets up a binary division between oneself and another, right? Someone who is somehow different from you. So in the colonial situation, right, it would be a racialized other, it could be a gendered other, and a lot of it's in the terms of the culture, right? But it's a culture not just of like, oh, your culture is different, but your culture is uncivilized. It's not worthy of being autonomy. In a lot of sense, this is the idea behind Rudyard Kipling's famous poem, "The White Man's Burden." And the white man's burden for Kipling, who was an apologist for British colonialism, was that it's the civilizing mission of white people, of Europeans, of the British Empire, to bring civilization, to bring market capitalism, to bring Christianity to the uncivilized. So it could be all of these things. It could be one or the other, just a couple of them, whatever you believe in particular. But it was the sense that, so this is how the ideology developed, right? Not necessarily that the first European, like Vasco da Gama, got to India because his whole intention was to do that, though his intentions may have also been to do many of those things. It developed over time that a project of colonization, which is an economic project, right, to exploit the resources and the people of a particular land and to bring them back for your own benefit and for the benefit of maybe the home country itself and its elites, becomes a project with its own discourse that justifies it. And it's justified through this discourse that sets up oppositions, that makes it natural, or what I mean by natural, makes it natural. It normalizes, makes it into a normal situation, or makes it into a natural situation that white people from these particular countries would dominate and have the right to dominate and civilize other peoples. So one of the, so the term I threw out here coming from Tyson is other, right? So othering for Tyson, which is one of the things I want you to consider for this week, is the practice of judging all who are different as less than fully human. That's on 401. And it, quote, divides the world between us, the civilized, and them, the others, the savages, 401. And I think if you think about it a little bit, you can see the work at play in American discourses about migration, about the refugee crisis and the border, You can see this in European discourses about Syrian refugees coming from the fallout in that country again. And you can see that in the discourses about Islam um, that come through in Islamophobic remarks. So those are things to think about really in terms of how othering continues to have operation even in a post-colonial world that we live in. Another thing that you might think of are science fiction novels, usually the use of alien societies. There is that othering, right, that is immediately present. You can think of many examples where the book or the film or the show uses the perception of othering at first and then slowly breaks that down. A great example for me, if you're a Game of Thrones fan, is the use of the wall. In Game of Thrones, there's some medieval kind of fantasy environment, and at the very northern end of the kingdoms is a giant wall, 700 feet high, and on the other side of the wall are other humans called wildlings, and they live in these kind of tribal groups, but their culture is kind of like, we would say, like a more primitive looking Northern European culture. But all the people who live south of the wall think the people on the north of to the north of the wall are wildlings. They call them wildlings, so they're automatically seen as savage. They think of them as more bloodthirsty and less than human. And George R. R. Martin, the creator of the show, is very smart about this. There's a lot of discussion about just what makes people on the other side of the wall different than people on the southern side of the wall. And the main thing is that nothing at all makes them different. It's just simply that one group of people's ancestors happened to be on different sides of the wall when it went up. And after centuries and centuries of protecting the wall, the people to its south see the people to the north as uncivilized savages who should be fought at all costs and resisted. And through the whole 8 seasons of the show, it doesn't center entirely on that, but it's a big issue for some of the characters. And it's something that is constantly an issue, that the wildlings are seen by various characters as inherently different, even though from our perspective as viewers, they don't look different at all. They look the same as the characters from the South. So it's an interesting dynamic. It's an interesting sort of post-colonial, and I think it's an intentional use of post-colonialism on George R. R. Martin's part. Okay, so that's enough of using othering to read Game of Thrones. Othering is built on discourses that apply binary oppositions in order to naturalize apparent differences. And they're similar to points made in psychoanalytic criticism and African American criticism. So I encourage you to go back to those chapters and review those to kind of see the overlap and to help you understand the concept a little bit more. Specific form of othering that Tyson talks about within post-colonial criticism is called Orientalism. And it's a specific type of othering that is Eurocentric. It's centered on European culture. Well, its values are set up by contrasting, especially people from the Middle East, but also India and other places in Asia, as, well, here's what she says. She says its purpose is to produce a positive national self-definition for Western nations by contrast with Eastern nations, in which the West projects all the negative characteristics it doesn't want to believe exist among its own people. So here we get another psychoanalytic concept through the term project. So we get that sense of projection, right? Thus, the Chinese or the Arabs, or whatever Asian or Middle Eastern population is politically convenient, are defined as cruel, sneaky, evil, cunning, dishonest, given to sexual promiscuity and perversion and the like. So you can, and you see this, I think, constantly in how people treat people of how Americans, especially, you see that a kind of in the ways in which Kathy is treated when she's wearing her hijab. Citizens of the West then define themselves in contrast, so this is on 402, to the imaginary Oriental they've created as kind, straightforward, good, upright, honest, and moral. In short, the Oriental is an invention of the West, by contrast to whom it has been able to define itself positively and justify any acts of military or economic aggression it has found advantageous. So this is a key part of it, right? Is how does a discourse get used unconsciously to justify a political set of policies and actions? How do residual forms of Orientalism continue to mark how the United States, as an imperial power, act in the world? I think it's an important question, and one that postcolonial critics ask and work on. I'm going to skip through her parts on Nordicism because I think this is her trying to show the flip side of it, how sort of Eurocentric ideology or othering creates a type of image of the European in contrast. But her main point here is that colonialist ideology is inherently Eurocentric. That's simply because Europeans conducted this. There are versions of this, you might say, for Japanese colonialism and even Chinese colonialism at certain points in time. But the vast majority of what we're talking about here is due to European colonialism. And it forms, and continuing on from my notes, and it forms a way of not only how colonized people are treated by the colonial administrators, but also how students in colonizer societies are taught about the culture, societies, and peoples that their governments have colonized. So it feeds back the people in the colonized societies, from the working class to the elite, have to also be given this Eurocentric colonialist ideology and what we call an Orientalist study of Asian and African and Middle Eastern peoples, because the point here is that for colonialism to be sustained, a society has to be produced at home in the colonizing society to support the colonial project. So you get both colonial supporters, people who would then, even if they would never personally benefit from it, they would go and join the military to subjugate a particular country far away because it was a colony of theirs, or because they believe that the people there are inherently bad and must therefore be acting against the national interests of their own country. But also to create colonial subjects, so people in those countries like British India, colonized persons who do not resist colonial subjugation because they're taught to believe in the superiority of their colonial country. So that in India's case, it would be Britain. In Syria's case, France, and therefore to believe in their own cultural inferiority. So there's always that interplay of even if you become a colonial subject where you don't resist that subjugation, and partly it's because you adopt that ideology in which you believe that colonial situation is justified for exactly the reasons set up by these Eurocentric discourses. So she goes in further. She's kind of working to build us to this idea of what do these colonial subjects, so people shaped by colonialism within the colonized society, how is their psychological identity shaped? And so post-colonial critics, especially writers like Homi Bhabha, have looked at these ideas of mimicry, hybridity, and double consciousness. And so what they're trying to look at is these are psychoanalytic concepts, but they're being applied in post-colonial discourses to describe how this consciousness, or this way of perceiving the world, is divided between two antagonistic cultures, that of the colonizer and that of the indigenous community. Double consciousness is a term that has a lot of weight in African American criticism through the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, who looks at how African Americans also have this double consciousness, or this double way of seeing, both shaped by whiteness and how white people view black people, and then how black people view themselves, and they're always possessing this divided consciousness. What I wanted to say about this is, in thinking about Zaytoun, it's very interesting how there's also this connection between how Zaytoun thinks about himself, which we get a lot in terms of him reciting the Quran, thinking about his family and his history and the politics of Syria, and sort of his awareness of anti-Arab racism even before the storm strikes. And also Kathy's experience, right? Kathy herself has not grown up in Syria or an Arab country, but because of her conversion to Islam and wearing the hijab visibly signifies Islam and Muslim culture, Muslim presence. So she begins to develop, you might say, a type of double consciousness where she's both inside Western society, an American society, having grown up in the very Eurocentric society. And you can see her kind of resist it and push, but also times when she wants the comfort of her family. And it's always a stressor, especially around her family, who can't seem to break from these Eurocentric and Orientalist perceptions of women in Islam, right? And they always see her as oppressed or subjected to something that's not for her. So there you might see the workings of a double consciousness that have shaped both Zaytoun and Kathy. The other concept from Baba's work is unhomeliness on 403, which also has a psychoanalytic origin. Actually comes, the idea of the unhomely or the uncanny comes from Freud himself. So Baba takes it and kind of uses it in the sense that to be unhomed is to not necessarily the same as being homeless, but to not feel at home even in your own home, which could be like your own country or your own place of residence, because you are not at home in yourself. Your cultural identity crisis has made you a psychological refugee, so to speak. So these are the sort of the interests in the psychoanalytic and psychological identity process that occurs through colonialism and occurs through specifically the discourses used by colonialism. So just a few more things here. The difficulty of responses to double consciousness and unhomeliness. So Tyson kind of goes a further step and says that, post-colonial writers and critics and political activists, so people fighting for independence, people opposing this colonial domination from outside. So you're from a country that has been dominated, say Vietnam, it's been dominated by the French. The French have brought Catholicism, they've brought their language, their alphabet, they've brought these Eurocentric, these discourses, these Orientalist discourses that displace the culture there, or at least denigrate the culture in comparison to French culture. So what's the pushback, right? So people push back, they fight back. Obviously, there's resistance, there wars against this. and then carried on to the U.S. Vietnam War. Um, and I mean, most people don't remember that there was a Vietnam War against the French um, right before the Americans got involved. So in the 50s, 40s, and 50s, right after World War II. So, um, a lot of people, some of the efforts to fight back might be returning to the pre-colonial language, if that language was fully displaced. Um, so she gives the example of the Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o, which I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but his writing basically, his project as a writer was to write in his native Kikuyu language, um, and then it would be translated back into English. But he was trying to create a literature in a language that had been displaced by English in colonized Kenya. Um, so it's kind of a double effort. This is what Tyson says. That's a pathway that some post-colonial writers have done, is to try to bring back the pre-colonial language. You see that even in Ireland, in the attempt to bring back Irish language and Irish language literature. Um, you could even extend that to Cajun in Louisiana, even though Cajuns were the descendants of a colonizing people, have a history of being colonized upon, and therefore the loss of the Cajun French language, which developed here in Louisiana indigenously, is itself the subject of a displacement as well. And so there is a possibility of doing a post-colonial reading of the effort to bring back Cajun language and music. Anyway, so that's a side note. That's a side note on my own research and writing. Um, but so what Tyson kind of points out here about this project, or about uh, the efforts to reclaim a pre-colonial past once the colonized country has been kicked out, in the case of, say, Ireland or India, um, is that there's this difficulty of ever returning to either the pre-colonial language if it's been pushed out so much, or the pre-colonial past itself, like the cultural practices, either because cultural loss and memory have been so extensive that you'd have to recreate things entirely from scratch, or just the fact that culture changes, right? And what post-colonial critics are very interested in is this idea of cultural change. It's not so much that the post-colonial criticism is simply about what bad things colonial discourse does and its oppressive characteristics, its sexism, its racism, its homophobia, and its effects on the psychology, but also the way in which Eurocentric discourses of those type presumed, in fact, that culture stays the same, right? That the culture of the dominating um, European powers itself is always this way, and the culture of the Indian or African or Irish was always this way, always its own way, and that these were deficient and these were superior, and it would always remain that way. And what post-colonial critics are very interested in is how these cultures interwove with each other. They transformed in ways that they weren't expecting to. And this is where she talks about this idea of hybridity on 404. The many theorists argue that post-colonial identity, so as we're talking about post-colonial subjects, so their identity is necessarily dynamic, constantly evolving hybrid of native and colonial cultures. So if you think about that, my question, how are, considering Zaytoun and Kathy as post-colonial subjects, then you might say, well, in what ways is their identity shaped by a constantly evolving hybrid between Syrian, Muslim, Arab cultures as we get it in this text, right? And also the dominant culture in the United States. In some ways, Kathy's pretty easy to see in that way, but also Zaytoun, right? In what ways is Zaytoun's beliefs, his thinking about Islam, the way he's portrayed as a father, might be ways in which Eggers, the writer, is trying to sort of show us this hybridity in his character. So postcolonial theorists are interested in both the problems that created colonialism and the problems of the response to colonialism. So the sort of dynamics or contradictions in anti-colonial discourses as well. It doesn't mean that they're simply reducing one to the other, for many are pointing out how colonialist ideology still pervades our society, even post-colonial societies, and how it shapes global political events, such as the War on Terror and the ongoing response to mass migrations and the refugee crisis. So it talked about hybridity. The cultures colonized and colonial and colonized cultures are interwoven, changing, influencing each other. And these are, what's important is that this is happening in ways that both the colonial administrators certainly never intended, because if the whole binary opposition requires that there's no sense that these two cultures could ever intermingle in ways, certainly not on an official level, because one is inferior to the other by the logic of that ideology and that discourse. So to allow them to interweave with each other would be to undermine the power dynamic that opposition is meant to maintain. The other aspect of that is that anti-colonial discourses too could, in many cases did, adopt simply the mirror reverse. That instead of saying our cultures are inferior, they would say, no, our cultures are actually superior to British culture or French culture, and that we need to resurrect, ideas of Arab greatness or Indian greatness or Kenyan greatness, Irish greatness and culture, and use that as now a model. And so then that would create, in a sense, a dynamic similar to colonialism, but in reverse. And so post-colonial critics are also very critical of the anti-colonialist forms of discourse that developed as well, that maybe try to utilize the same discursive terms and arguments, but reverse them, put on top the colonized culture. And obviously problems with that can occur, say, like in India, where what constitutes Indian culture? Who gets to decide who is Indian? In a country where, in a country of billions, where religious identity is in flux, there's multiple different interpretations of just what does it mean to be Hindu and Muslim. Political identity, language, the country of thousands of languages. So which language dominates? Which language becomes the language of administration, of the new state? And these actually were battles fought out. And I mean, one of the first ones was over the question of should the new Indian country be a country, a multi-religious country, or should Muslim Indians have their own country and Hindu Indians have their own country as well? And that, of course, produced the partition, which became Pakistan, Bangladesh. They were just one country at that time, was the Muslim country, and what is now India was the Hindu one. And so that led to huge population transfers and thousands, I think maybe millions of people dead in the riots and the forced displacements that occurred as Muslims moved from cities that and states that would be part of the Hindu state to Pakistan, and vice versa. So these populations were actually already very integrated, um, even if some, there were majorities in different areas. So, anyways, the point being that the anti-colonial discourses of those particular movements that won independence in India um, worked to set up differing ideas of culture that produced its own problems. The same thing in Ireland, in defining Irish culture and defining Irish identity. So those are areas that I'm a little bit more familiar with. Um, so and these are things that post-colonial critics look at. So then lastly is the post-colonial criticism and literature section of the text that I'm going to kind of skip over. Of course, I want you to read the whole chapter. I'm going to kind of, but the rest of it I feel like is an application and an up-to-date kind of looking at what post-colonialism looks at, especially regarding a world now where post-colonial questions aren't really so much about independence struggles and colonization, right? Since most of those big global empires were broken apart uh, between World War II and 1970, 75 for the Portuguese Empire. So now what kind of post-colonial questions turn to are really questions about neo-colonialism, the effects of still having a global division of wealth and difference, right? Obviously, because Europe and the United States still occupy um, positions of privilege and power created by their colonial pasts, and much of the Middle East, Africa, obviously South and Central America, the Caribbean, East Asia, Southeast Asia. All these areas have been shaped by colonialism and the expropriation of their power, their resources, their intellectual capacities, their knowledge, and that exploitation has created an unequal and uneven world. And that uneven and unequal world maps out more or less along the lines of these old colonial empires. So the questions now today are really, how do these ideologies continue to play out in the workings of the global economy, what we now call like global, or what we did call maybe about almost 20 years ago, and still a little bit globalization back in its heyday, and now through questions of displacement, of the environment, of the global crisis regarding global warming, ecology, and also questions of things of like tourism, where people from the first world travel about the third world. That reshapes those economies through things like ecotourism, um, to create a place that economically benefits from tourist travel and movement, not migration, but movement, but also sets up exploitive um, actions, displaces people from the natural environments, the forests and other landscapes that are now valuable for tourism sites and locations. I think about beaches in Sri Lanka or in Thailand, areas where people may have been living on those beaches. And then think about how many people from the United States, the United Kingdom, or Australia go on vacation to Thailand and visit those beautiful beaches. But now those are these great waterways. And as a friend of mine was posting on Instagram, she was saying, "No, it looks pretty in the picture, but all these boats that are taking tourists are tearing up the coral under the water. They're polluting. The water's filled with plastic bottles and oil." So it's really the effects are, Thailand's an independent country. We're not in a colonial situation anymore, but there's a way in which colonial ideas about the use of land, the thinking about these places now as playgrounds for tourists, and the way in which those countries themselves, in the desperate need to bring in income, transform those landscapes, pushing out indigenous peoples, pushing out workers, displacing people, either to bring in factories that build your phones and your computers, or pushing out people so that they migrate to other places and do work, like building skyscrapers in Oman and the UAE. This happens a lot in South Asia. So the global economy's practices have changed in such a way, but we still need the questions of post-colonialism. How are places othered and why? Is essentially that question. So for Tyson, really, it's the looking at the text, both reading the text with the grain. Does a text try to tell you something about colonialism and anti-colonialism? And is it trying to resist the oppressiveness of colonialism's ideology? So this is what she's talking about, 422. So you can read a text with the grain, which means how the writer is inviting you to read it, or you could read it against the grain. So your question is really, for Zaytoun, is Eggers inviting you to read the text as an anti-colonial text, as a post-colonial text? Is he trying to get you to see othering? How is he trying to get you to see othering and its operations? And why does he want you to see that? So if you see that that's happening. The other thing is to read it against the grain. And so she gives this example. I'll kind of go over it real quick, and I think that this will be it. So in 422 and 23, she talks about Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which is a classic text on imperialism. It's the basis for the movie Apocalypse Now, if you've seen that, and many other novels about sort of madness and warfare and the journey to darkness. And so she writes about this, that Conrad's text is an example, is an extremely anti-colonialist. It's in its negative representation of the colonial enterprise. The Europeans conducting the ivory trade in the Congo are portrayed as heartless, greedy thieves who virtually enslaved the indigenous population to help collect and transport the Europeans' loot, and the negative effects of the European presence on the native peoples are graphically depicted. So that's a straightforward, the text is trying to invite the reader to see colonialism negatively. So we would say that it is either an anti-colonial text or post-colonial text in that sense, even though Conrad he's a Polish-British writer from 1902, so he's not an African writer, but he's writing about the colonial enterprise in Africa. Okay. So then Tyson says that, however, Chinua Achebe, who is a Nigerian writer, observes that the novel's condemnation of Europeans is based on a definition of Africans as savages. Beneath their veneer of civilization, the Europeans are, the novel tells us, as barbaric as the Africans. So in this sense, Chinua Achebe is saying that Conrad's assumptions is that Africans themselves are simply savages too. The exploitation of them is bad, but what's really happening, according to Achebe, is that for Conrad, the Europeans are behaving as bad as this image of the savage African. So it's not that Africans are actually savages, it's that Conrad unconsciously is still supporting that notion that non-European peoples are still inferior to, and that what colonialism is doing is leading Europeans down a road to where they would become inferior in their culture and customs and morality. So there's this dynamic there, right? That it's not really as what it seems. And indeed, Achebe notes, the novel portrays Africans as a prehistoric mass of frenzied, howling, incomprehensible barbarians. And any time that a text shows you a group of people and they're never actually real individuals, that's telling you something. This comes up a lot if you watched like Lord of the Rings or read Lord of the Rings, that there is this kind of way in which characters like the orcs, who are just a mass of evil, monstrous villains, and you never actually learn an orc's name. You never get an orc as an actual character. They're just kind of a mass of barbaric killing machines. So that type of text is actually inviting you to see a whole group of people, even if it's fictitious and fantasy. It's seen through a worldview in which a whole group of people can be seen as a negative grouping without any individuality. Some science fiction writers have played with that, right, and have tried to create stories where orcs are actual, have actual personalities and characteristics, and aren't all the same. Aren't all evil, right? And we've watched things like that as well, where the sort of monster character is deconstructed. So continuing with Tyson's, she's quoting Achebe, Africa is a setting and backdrop that eliminates the African as human factor. Africa is a symbolic battlefield devoid of all recognizable humanity, into which the wandering European enters at his peril. So this is what Achebe is saying about how Africa is portrayed by Conrad, even though Conrad is also presenting an anti-colonial and negative portrayal of colonial domination in Africa. That there's still this way in which Africa is thought about as inherently savage and its people as not really human. In other words, despite Heart of Darkness's obvious anti-colonialist agenda, the novel points to the colonized population as the standard of savagery to which Europeans are compared. Thus, Achebe uncovers the novel's colonialist subtext, of which the text does not seem to be aware. So that's what a reading against the grain means. It means looking for what the text may not be aware of, but is still operating within its assumptions and its discourses. So that's what I want to kind of leave it on, just to invite you to read Zaytoun Against the Grain as well. So it's very easy and useful and important to read it with the grain. How does Eggers invite you to read these characters and to read their situation? But also to look at what sort of assumptions might Eggers be operating within that reinforce colonialist ideologies. And that's up for you to determine and share with the class for this week's discussion forum. So thank you so much, and I will see you again on this video next week. Take care.